Hello, and welcome to Unpacking Europe, the podcast from the Centre for European Reform. I'm Ian Bond, the CER's Deputy Director, and I'm joined today by Ambassador Pedro Serrano, the Ambassador of the European Union in London, at least for a few more days, because the Ambassador will be leaving his post and retiring from the European External Action Service in the coming days. He's had a long and distinguished career, both as a Spanish diplomat and as an EU official and diplomat. And we thought it would be interesting to get his thoughts on the development of EU diplomacy over the last few decades and on the EU-UK relationship, which he's seen up close for the last few years. So welcome, Pedro. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much, Ian. I'm very happy to be here and to join you this morning. Thanks for
Great.
calling on me.
So let's start with your early years as an EU official. After 18 years as a Spanish diplomat, in 2003 you started to work for Javier Solana, who was the first EU High Representative for the Common Foreign and Security Policy. So what was Solana able to do as High Rep that the EU had not been able to do before?
Well, Solana provided continuity in representing externally the voice of the European Union, particularly as regards what we call common foreign and security policy, or the foreign affairs part of things. Because at the time, we still had rotating presidencies of the Council that were responsible for the representation of the European Union, which means that the person that chaired the Foreign Affairs Council and that visited different countries to represent the European Union during each period was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the country that had the rotating presidency, and at higher level, head of state or government of the country that was having the rotating presidency. But this meant that every 6 months there was someone new. Then this was thought that it did not provide good enough continuity in the representation. It was better to have a figure that people could always call to. You know, the famous Kissinger quote, whom to call. And if you're changing every 6 months, it's a bit more difficult to build a relationship that is necessary to pursue clarity, a foreign policy line and the representation. And Solana was the ideal person to do this. Not only had he been already foreign minister for Spain, which is a relatively big country in world affairs and definitely one of the big countries of the European Union, but he had also been Secretary General of NATO. And with this, he brought to the job very impressive expertise and also contacts. His phone list was really a good phone list. He could reach anyone, and people would pick up the phone and talk to him. And he would sit at the right of the chair of the council and during the council meetings of ministers of foreign affairs. And therefore, he did provide that continuity in the representation of the European Union. And on top of that, there was a time when we were developing the European security and defense policy. And these instruments, he was also at the same time not only high representative, he was Secretary General of the Council. And in that capacity of Secretary General of the Council, he was responsible for all the instruments that were being created for crisis management and for development of the defense policy within the European Union. And therefore, he had new tools at his disposal. And these tools did not exist before. Tools that allowed the European Union to deploy crisis management missions and operations, which we started doing at really a very high rhythm, and developing all the necessary structures that are required to be able to deploy and provide command and control for those operations. So it was really a period of very intense activity on foreign affairs and on security and defense policy led by Javier Solana, which actually was a trailblazing and opened the way for what became afterwards the High Representative Vice President of the Commission, because at the time Solana was sharing this external representation with the Commissioner for External Relations, who was responsible for the external dimension of the responsibilities of the Commission, but not for CFSP or Common Foreign Security Policy, nor for the security and defense policy. And so he worked at the time very well with Chris Patton, who was the External Relations Commissioner when Solana was appointed, and afterwards with Benita Ferrero-Waldner.
Yeah. So that leads on quite nicely to the sort of the next phase in the evolution of EU foreign policy, because as you've sort of hinted at there, Solana had quite a small operation in terms of the council secretariat. He didn't have a diplomatic service working for him. And it was the Commission which had commission delegations in many countries, but the competence of the Commission delegations didn't include the foreign policy issues. So you then went on from having worked for Solana. You headed what I think was called the Council Secretariat Liaison Office to the UN in New York. And then when the next big change in EU foreign policy occurred with the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, you became the EU's first ambassador to the UN. So can you talk me through what difference did the Lisbon Treaty and the creation of the European External Action Service make to the way that the EU could carry out foreign policy?
Let me go back again a bit to the Solana time, because there were two foreign relations structures there. It was the policy unit, where all member states had representatives in this policy unit. It was headed by a brilliant German diplomat, Christoph Heusgen, who went afterwards on to become, for many, many years, the diplomatic advisor of the Chancellor of Germany. And there we had diplomats from all member states, and they would provide a sort of a chambre de réflexion, a sort of a reflection chamber on all foreign policy issues, and would advise the High Representative. But also there was a Director General for External Relations within the Council Secretariat, and this was handed over to a brilliant diplomat as well, a brilliant British diplomat, Robert Cooper. And he was also responsible for the administrative machinery of the Council Secretariat that started creating more solidly what then became, I think, partly the External Action Service, with departments responsible for also all the geographical regions, and under which also all these structures for security and defense policy were created. I think Solana showed that this formula of having a permanent representative made sense, was necessary, but that it was also necessary to create a more coherent structure together with the Commission. And not only that, but that it was important to ensure that the external offices, the delegations of the Commission, became delegations of the European Union, to be able to pursue that permanence in representation with all the spectrum of the representation of the European Union, not only in Brussels, but also across the world. And so, as you rightly said, when the Treaty of Lisbon was developed, it was decided to create this External Action Service that would have this network of 146 delegations, embassies, that would represent the European Union across the world, including, of course, in international organizations such as the United Nations. And the External Action Service was, in fact, a merger of the structures that existed within the Council Secretariat, including the security defense structures, plus the structures that existed in what we used to call DG Relics, the Director General for External Relations of the Commission, and all the delegations that were Commission delegations across the world that in the past were not formally responsible for representation of the European Union. They were only representing the Commission and were not formally in charge of the foreign and security policy, which was a member state's competence, and therefore was the external. They did not have that capacity to represent fully the European Union abroad, and this is what the Treaty of Lisbon allowed us to bring together. Also, double hatting the High Representative as Vice President of the Commission, so that this person could also help coordinate all the external action of the Commission and ensure coherence between that external action of the Commission and the common foreign and security policy.
So just to ask you a supplementary about your time in New York, what was different, as it were, from the time before the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty and your becoming the ambassador to the UN, and the time after that? You know, how in practical terms was the EU able to act differently after the changeover?
Well, first, all the coordination responsibility for the European Union, be it at headquarters, the Council of Foreign Affairs, a meeting of ministers of defense, council, also meetings of ministers of development, All this was placed under a permanent chair. The chair was the High Representative. Likewise, across the world, the different delegations assumed responsibility for the coordination of the positions of embassies of member states abroad. In the case of the UN, this was something very serious because in the United Nations, we have to coordinate for positions constantly. There are every day quite a few meetings, in total around 1,200 meetings a year, just to be able to present and represent EU positions at the United Nations in an effective manner. But also in the United Nations, you have a big responsibility in liaising with other negotiating groups, with the non-aligned, with the G77, with regional groups, the African group, the Asian group, Latin American group, and Caribbean. And the advantage of having the same person do this over a longer period of time, normally an ambassador would be there for about 4 years, gives continuity in that representation and allows you to build the relationship in that job that makes your engagement with our partners more effective and provides continuity in that engagement. Whereas if you're changing ambassadors every 6 months, you may have, a greater variety of interlocutors, and this creates confusion. So who do I have to talk to now? Is it still ambassador from country X, or do I have to talk now with country Y? So you provide at least a stable interlocutor. That brings also more stable policy lines.
Yeah. So you mentioned there the issue of confusion over who to talk to, and I'm going to move a little further forward in your career. You had two very important jobs back in Brussels. You worked as the principal advisor on external affairs to the first that's the first permanent president of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy. And then after your time working for him, you went back to the External Action Service, first as Deputy Secretary General with responsibility for CSDP and crisis response, but then, perhaps more pertinently, as Chef de Cabinet to the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and the Vice President of the European Commission, one of the least lovely titles in Brussels, I think. But the HRVP, your compatriot, Josep Borrell. And I think outsiders often find the foreign policy roles of the President of the European Council, the President of the European Commission, and the HRVP quite confusing. So I wonder, can you say a bit about the division of labor between these various institutions, and also about the ongoing debate in Brussels and between the member states about how this might evolve, about how, whether the EU is doing foreign policy in the most effective way? And in particular, I wonder, is it fair to blame the External Action Service, as some people have done in the recent past, when the EU is unable to act effectively and in unison in its external policy? Or is in fact that shifting the blame where it doesn't belong?
No, thank you. Thank you. A lot of questions there, Jan, and very
Yeah.
complex ones. I would say that formally, the different responsibilities are well reflected in the treaty. And for example, the President of the European Council, he's responsible for the external representation of the European Union at the highest level, without prejudice to the competencies of the High Representative, which means that he does not do policy per se, in principle, but he represents that policy at the highest level. Of course, when he or she is chairing the European Council, it is important he or she play a very important role in shaping the positions of the European Council, and he or she will have the legitimacy of the backing of the European Council in addition to whatever the treaty says in terms of representing those positions, because he or she will come with the backing of the heads of state and government of the European Union when he's presenting a position to another international leader. The President of the Commission is responsible for the external action dimension of all the Commission activities, which means excluding CFSP. That seems to be a very nice line that you can draw. Of course, in reality, it is a much more complex line. Can you really do foreign policy if your migration policy is different and your trade policy is different, your cooperation policy is different, you have enlargement and whatever also run differently. So the reality is that despite the fact that the treaty seems to delineate very carefully and well these various responsibilities, in order to function effectively, it requires that all the actors, the two heads, President of the Council, European Council, and the Commission, plus the High Representative, who really runs the hardcore policy machine, because that feeds and should feed into the President of the European Council and into the President of the European Commission. It requires really a very intense coordination activity between the presidents and the High Representative and Vice President, as well as between their teams, in order to be effective. And I think that's the role of cabinet. When I was with Van Rompuy, I was all the time coordinating with my colleague and counterpart in Barroso, the president of the Commission's team, and I was all the time receiving inputs from the External Action Service and engaging with the Secretary General of the External Action Service in order to ensure that continuity and that coherence of action. Same when I was head of cabinet for Borrell. My main job was to ensure that we were engaging with the presidents and that we were engaging with the Commission and all the external dimension of the Commission to ensure that coherence. But this requires essentially that all the human pieces of that puzzle work as effectively as possible amongst themselves. And we are only human, which means that sometimes we work more effectively amongst ourselves, other times we work less effectively. Can you put the blame on machines? I think on administrative machines. Would the External Action Service be better or more effective if it was placed elsewhere? I think one of the big questions of the External Action Service is that if we're going to do foreign policy, an EU foreign policy, we need the trust of member states. And that's the beauty of the present construct, that it tries to ensure ownership of member states by ensuring that 1/3 of the diplomats within the External Action Service come from diplomatic services of member states. And in order to inject that legitimacy, which is something that does not exist in other Commission branches. So, of course, we also have to take into account that the High Representative herself, in this case, is chairing the council formations on foreign policy. And when she's chairing that, she has to be, let's say, a neutral actor, or she can be proactive, of course, and has to be and is proactive, but she has to take into account the views of member states very heavily. And it's about how you manage those views and come to an effective policy ultimately. So I think it's a very difficult construct, and any construct will be very difficult because you have to square a very complicated and large circle. I don't think the main problems lie, or the solutions lie, within what you do with the External Action Service. I do think that it is actually a very complex matter, and that perhaps member states have to reflect more clearly on the chains of command they have established, and if necessary, review those chains of command.
Yeah. So one of the biggest tests for both the machinery and the people came with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And your time with Borrell concluded just a few months after the start of that invasion. But I was very struck by something that he said at the time. He said, "The Ukraine war marks the birth of a geopolitical Europe. It is the moment we became fully aware of the challenges we face and our responsibilities." So I wonder, how would you say the Union has met those responsibilities since February 2022? And how has it shared them with others, particularly with NATO? Because, you know, if I look back sort of 20 years or more, there was no relationship between the EU and NATO, or practically no relationship between the EU and NATO. Over the years, it's gradually got closer. And this crisis has really forced the two perhaps to work together in some ways. But I wonder, you know, from your perspective, how has the EU faced its responsibilities, and how has it cooperated with NATO in the process?
No, thank you. Thank you. A lot of questions again, and complex ones. on how did the EU react to the 2022 Russian aggression against Ukraine? And, before we were saying, are we being effective? And is the External Action Service being effective? I would say that most of the time the External Action Service is being effective in doing its job. I think that you stop doing your job well when member states do not agree on the policy. And that has nothing to do with the External Action Service per se. It has to do with the decision taking at the Council and the spanners that may be thrown into the machine by one or the other member states occasionally. When there is agreement on what to do, we are being very effective. And I think the present setup is being effective. So the question is on the position of member states, and the EU is an extremely generous construct. It gives member states a true voice in world affairs. Some may have it naturally and may have it bilaterally. Others will only have it because they are part of the European Union, or mainly because they're part of the European Union, because their national weight would be much inferior to the global weight of definitely of the European Union. And they have a say on things that otherwise their voice would have more difficulties in being heard. So the decision making is a very important part. And I have to say that in the Ukraine crisis, decision making was impeccable. There was full agreement by member states. We immediately undertook sanctions and the support to Ukraine, macro-financial, military support to Ukraine, diplomatic support to Ukraine, humanitarian support to Ukraine, and in a magnitude, an order of magnitude that is totally unprecedented, not only for the EU, but for anyone else as well. So it was a very, I would say, effective response with full. And again, we were talking earlier about the coordination between the Commission and the External Action Service and other actors in foreign affairs. There was no problem in coordination. We really all were pushing in the same direction and wanting to move in the same direction, which also happened, by the way, in the response against COVID, which also had an important international dimension. So in the big crises, you see how all the actors come together and member states, of course, understand the gravity of the situation as well and take really very impressive decisions, including looking at sources of financing, because both for the COVID crisis and for Ukraine, the European Union has had recourse to this credit guaranteed by the budget of the European Union, which gives the European Union and member states a tremendous financial firepower. So it was, I think, a very impressive response. Now, on NATO, I would not be as negative as you sounded. In reality, NATO has always been part of the discussion in the EU of defense. The role of NATO is clearly recognized in the Treaty of the European Union, indicating that collective defense would be a responsibility of NATO for those EU member states that are members of NATO. And immediately at the beginning of the development of the European security and defense policy, we reached agreements with NATO, the famous Berlin Plus agreements, that through which NATO would put at the disposal of the European Union assets in order to facilitate its crisis management. It was essentially command and control, the use of SHAPE as an operation headquarters for EU operations. Of course, this became more complicated after 2004, notably, essentially because of Turkish Cypriot related issues. And the relationship has been more complicated. At the time, defense was seen as crisis management. Today, defense is not seen as crisis management. Today, defense is seen as deterrence, and for that, development of defense capabilities. And here we have seen how the EU has tools that allow it to support member states, which are also NATO members, in developing those very much needed defense capabilities. But it also has tools, for example, to facilitate military mobility across Europe, in which we're also working very much together with NATO. When I was Deputy Secretary General for Security and Defense Policy, one of my main goals at the time, and I understood it very quickly, was to improve the cooperation. And we created standing working groups with NATO. We would meet at highest level or highest official level regularly to look at our cooperation, what we were doing together. We achieved 2 major joint declarations with NATO in 2016, 2018. So, final point, Ukraine showed as well that the EU has a lot to bring in terms of defense that is not necessarily related to command and control. And this is all the military support that the EU was able to provide to Ukraine, and even with great or freer hands to provide this to Ukraine, because NATO had to be very watchful on what kind of role it was going to play in support of Ukraine in order not to exacerbate or to lead to an escalation that would have been delicate, which actually led to a situation where the EU was in the front line in supporting Ukraine at the very beginning, particularly, and not so much NATO, but the EU played a very important role. And also, of course, the multi-dimension nature of defense, which is not only military support, but it requires macro-financial support. If we had not been able to provide the macro-financial or humanitarian diplomatic support we provided for Ukraine, Ukraine would have had increased difficulties. And all this was provided by the European Union. So NATO realized that huge potential of the EU as an actor in defense as well.
Yeah. So, Pedro, we've talked about some complicated questions. I'm now going to ask you a much simpler question, which is about your work in London. I mean, it's been a turbulent period in British domestic politics. Andy Burnham is the third Prime Minister since you arrived in London. But it's been a generally positive period for the development of the EU-UK relationship. So, I mean, first of all, how do you assess the progress that's been made over the last 4 years? And what might the future hold for EU-UK relations? And perhaps a very last question. If it's not giving away secrets, what's your advice to your successor and to your headquarters in Brussels about building relations with Andy Burnham and his team in these new circumstances?
Yes, I concur with you, Ian, on the evolution of the relationship in this last 4 years. It is going in the right direction. Brexit was a traumatic divorce, and we've started overcoming that divorce to build a new relationship that has to be very close. And this started already with Prime Minister Sunak. I arrived shortly after he had been appointed Prime Minister, and both him and Foreign Secretary Cleverly and Secretary for Northern Ireland, Eden Harris, were very clear in wanting to find a solution to what was then really igniting the fire in the relationship, which was the Northern Ireland Protocol. And this, indeed, just a few months later, they were able to agree, Rishi Sunak, with the President of the Commission, the Windsor Framework, which created more implementable and practical way to address a very complex issue, because the Northern Irish status within the agreements is a very complex and ad hoc, something you could not replicate elsewhere, solution to a very complex political and economic situation. And so that started already with Prime Minister Sunak. But of course, the big change started with the reset that Labour Party launched. It was part of their political manifesto, and they started, Starmer and his team, and notably my very good friend Nick Thomas-Symonds, Minister for Relations with the European Union, how to change the relationship and bring again the EU and the UK closer together. This, in parallel, we were receiving, or actually you, think tankers and universities were producing all the reports indicating the impact that Brexit had had on the UK, had affected negatively trade, had affected negatively prospects for GDP growth. So there was a conscience of the need to have a closer relationship with the European Union, and that the free trade agreement does not eliminate all hurdles for trade. You have a lot of non-tariff barriers that appear when you leave the internal market. And actually, since the UK was the only country that ever left the internal market of the European Union, this was not something that was discovered, that you could have a free trade agreement, but it did not mean that trade was as free as it was when the UK was part of the single market. And I think Nick Thomas-Symonds and Prime Minister Starmer started working out what kind of engagement do we need to carry out with the European Union in order to eliminate some of these barriers. And this is the case notably with this phytosanitary agreement that's being worked on. But also, how can we ensure that our people remain closer together, which is the youth experience scheme that we're working on, which is rejoining Erasmus Plus, and also other trade barriers that could happen. For example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the need to have linkage between our emission trading systems, or as well the United Kingdom joining the European Union market for electricity, which will not only increase the energy security of both sides, but will provide the United Kingdom with a huge market on which to export its clean energy. All these wind farms in the North Sea and elsewhere. It would not make full sense if they could not export energy to the rest of Europe. And for that, joining the electricity market of the European Union would be a very important step. So in a very pragmatic way, in ensuring that this is all mutually beneficial, the Starmer team started working on all these agreements. I have to say that on the EU side, there was a full commitment also to advance in this direction, because both sides realized that beyond the economic aspects of the relationship, which are very important. We have to say that the European Union is by far the largest trading partner for the UK. It's 47% of trade compared to 16% US and 6% China. So just to give you an idea. Even beyond that, we are part of a continent that is challenged. And we have to respond to these challenges by becoming stronger together. And so that's the route that we have undertaken now to strengthen the relationship across all dimensions, of course, respecting the concerns of each side and the need also to maintain the integrity on the EU side, particularly of the single market of the European Union, internal market, which is a vital piece of the European Union. But having said that, we are, I think, both sides very much convinced on the strategic importance of this relationship and the need to continue strengthening it, because a stronger EU-UK relationship will mean a stronger Europe, a Europe more capable of defeating Russia's intentions in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe, ensuring that Europe remains free, democratic, and that it can, from that position, from freedom and democracy and prosperity, help the rest of the world move also in a better direction. We have to see, of course, Prime Minister Burnham, which direction he will take the ship. All the statements that have been made so far seem to indicate that he will continue this line of engagement. And I think he will be received with open arms on the side of the European Union by the two presidents, by Maroš Šefčovič, commissioner in charge of the relationship and in charge of trade, by the way. I'm sure that the relationship will continue evolving in a very positive way.
Well, that's a good sort of uplifting note on which to end, because sadly, I think that's all we have time for. Ambassador Serrano, Pedro, thank you very much for talking to us. It's been a huge pleasure for me to work with you and your excellent team over the last 4 years. Very enjoyable. I wish you luck with your next steps. I find it hard to believe that you are simply going to retire to the golf course, although I'm sure you'll spend more time there. But I hope we will see you in London from time to time.
Well, many, many thanks, Ian. I really look forward to that. And I do want to take this opportunity to thank CER, Center for European Reform, for the amazing work that you do. You personally have been an amazing partner over these last years, as has been Charles Grant. And I do want to thank you both wholeheartedly for that great cooperation, for the work that you do, also in helping bring the EU and the UK closer together, which is what really needs to be done. So I look forward to remaining engaged with you as well in the future. And again, big thanks.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much to our listeners for listening to this episode of Unpacking Europe from the Centre for European Reform. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe to the series on your preferred podcast platform and leave us a good review. Thank you very much and goodbye.